The Industrial Revolution, when you hear that, I don't know, it conjures up images of factories, right? Smokestacks everywhere, machines. But what I find so interesting is how deeply connected this period of history is to things that seem completely unrelated. So today we're going to try to uncover some of those unexpected connections. And we're going to travel from Britain, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, all the way to the diamond mines of southern Africa.
Yeah, I think it's a journey that really challenges our understanding of cause and effect because it'll show you how even events that seem very isolated can have these huge ripple effects across the entire globe.
Exactly. Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Let's imagine Britain before the Industrial Revolution. Life was mostly rural, right? Agriculture ruled, and the seasons kind of set the pace for everything. But even in those quieter times, there was a different kind of industry going on, smaller scale, the cottage industries, like wool making.
And those cottage industries were really vital to the pre-industrial economy, even though they might seem kind of insignificant now.
Totally. Like if you just think about the process of turning wool into cloth. First, you've got to shear the sheep. Then there's washing the wool, combing it out all by hand, and then spinning it into thread on those, spinning wheels. It's amazing. And finally, the weaver gets involved, using a hand loom to weave those threads into fabric. It's unbelievable when you think about all that work. It's kind of a testament to how skilled and inventive people were, even back then. But, and here's the thing, that kind of idyllic picture of pre-industrial Britain, well, it existed alongside something much darker, something that really helped finance Britain's growing power. And that's the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, it's this really stark contrast, a really dark side that often gets overlooked. While families were making wool in their homes, this massive, this awful system of exploitation was making Britain wealthier.
It's just, the scale of the transatlantic slave trade is almost impossible to grasp. It's just horrific. Can you tell us a bit more about how it actually worked?
Well, it was this complex network, really, with three main stages. It started with the capture and trading of African people in West Africa, often through these really brutal raids and wars that were, sadly, encouraged by Europeans who wanted enslaved people. Then came the horrific journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage. Millions of captives suffered unimaginable conditions on those slave ships, packed in so tightly.
Right.
The ones who actually survived that horrific journey, they were then sold into forced labor, mostly on plantations in the Americas.
Right. And Bristol played a major part in this, didn't it?
Absolutely. Bristol was a huge port city. For more than a century, you had ships sailing from there to West Africa to trade for enslaved people.
Right.
The ships, they'd be carrying hundreds of those captives, and the conditions were terrible, cramped, and unsanitary. Then it was the Middle Passage. It's a chilling reminder that Bristol was really complicit in this dark period.
It's hard to wrap your head around how could something as awful as the slave trade be so closely tied to a whole nation's success? I mean, what was even being produced on those plantations that was so impactful?
Sugar.
Sugar, really. We
Okay.
just buy it at the store now.
I know, right? But back then, in Europe, sugar was a luxury. But demand just soared, and it became a staple, something everyone wanted. And to meet that demand, plantation owners relied on the labor of enslaved Africans, that insatiable need for sugar. Well, it created the wealth that would eventually fuel Britain's industrial ambitions.
So you start to see the connections appear, right? From those quiet cottage industries in Britain to the horrors of the slave trade and those sugar plantations, it all links together. The story of the Industrial Revolution is more complicated than it might seem at first.
It really is. And as we dig deeper, you'll see more and more surprising links between ambition, innovation, and exploitation. All these threads that ultimately shape the world we live in today.
So we've set the scene right, pre-industrial Britain, just like on the edge of these massive changes. And then boom, the Industrial Revolution just explodes onto the scene. We're talking huge inventions, the spinning jenny, the water frame, and of course the steam engine. Suddenly there are factories popping up left and right, powered by coal and steam, changing everything. It's an era of incredible innovation, such a shift from those quieter cottage industries. It's just, these changes weren't just about, making things faster. They really reshaped the entire fabric of society.
Exactly. Think about factories. They became these like magnets pulling people from the countryside into these growing industrial towns and cities. It's urbanization on an unprecedented scale, people clustering around these new hubs of work. And naturally, you get these new social structures emerging, new challenges, and sadly, a whole new level of hardship for a lot of people.
It's true. It wasn't all, progress and prosperity like some history books might have you believe. I mean, my notes here mention things like terrible living conditions, widespread poverty. What was it actually like for the average worker during this time?
For many, it was a life of just brutal poverty and nonstop work. We're talking factory workers, men, women, even children, putting in these exhausting hours, often in really dangerous conditions. And for what? For barely enough to get by. It's hard to imagine now, but children, some as young as 5 or 6, toiling away in those textile mills, dwarfed by those massive machines. It's a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of all this so-called progress. And the living conditions, just awful. Families packed into cramped tenements, no proper sanitation, hardly any fresh air. A far cry from that idyllic countryside so many of them had to abandon.
It's no surprise that people started pushing back, that you see the rise of social unrest in this period. You have the Luddites, for example, famously protesting against those machines they felt were taking their jobs, and then the swing riots that broke out in rural England. It seems like sheer desperation drove people to take such drastic action.
Yeah, and it's easy to dismiss these acts of resistance as just being against progress. But when you look closer, you see they came from very real grievances. The Luddites, they weren't opposed to technology itself, but the way it was being used to push out skilled workers, to drive down wages. Their actions, even if destructive at times, were a desperate attempt to cling to their way of life. And the swing riots, they were fueled by economic hardship and this deep sense of injustice, especially with the enclosure of common land, which really hurt those rural communities. It's fascinating, though, how they used that mythical figure, Captain Swing, as their alias, to spread their message and, I guess, avoid getting caught. Letters signed by Captain Swing demanding better wages, better conditions. It created this sense of fear, but it also shows how resourceful and desperate those fighting for their rights really were.
So, in a way, those uprisings, as chaotic as they seemed, planted the seeds for the organized labor movement we know today.
Exactly. The Luddites, the swing rioters, they might not have achieved their goals right away, but they paved the way for a more unified fight. Organizations like the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, the GNCTU, emerged, and they started fighting for workers' rights, for better pay, for safer working conditions. It just goes to show that progress is rarely a straight line. It's messy, full of struggles and pushback.
It really makes you think about that whole narrative of progress and how it's often told. While Britain was dealing with the growing pains of industrialization, a world away, a completely different kind of transformation was about to begin, driven by the discovery of something truly captivating: diamonds.
And that's what takes us to southern Africa, a region that might seem a million miles away from those smoky factories. But the discovery of diamonds, well, that would soon draw southern Africa right into the center of this industrial whirlwind.
Okay, so we're talking Southern Africa now, 1860s. This is before South Africa was a unified country, right? So what was it like back then, like socially, politically? Paint us a picture.
You got it. It wasn't a unified nation then, not at all. Imagine like a patchwork of different communities all trying to figure things out. You had indigenous groups like the Swana people, the Griqua, who were descended from both Dutch and Khoisan people. Then you had the Boers, descended from those early Dutch settlers. And of course, you can't forget about the British Empire expanding its reach everywhere. Every group had their own goals, their own anxieties. It was a time of big change.
And right in the middle of all this, diamonds are discovered. That's got to shake things up.
Oh, absolutely. 1867, right? Diamonds are found near this small hill, Colesberg-Kopje later on. Everyone would know it as Kimberley. But yeah, that discovery, it set off a mad scramble, a diamond rush. I mean, people came from everywhere, all over the world. Prospectors, adventurers, you name it, all chasing that dream of striking it rich.
I bet it was total chaos. It's like that classic story, that allure of easy money. It makes people do crazy things.
Yeah.
But these weren't just, pretty stones, were they? Diamonds.
No way. Diamonds were valuable for more than just their looks. They were incredibly hard, which made them super important for industrial uses. And, of course, they had that brilliance, that sparkle. The whole world was captivated. Owning a diamond, it was like holding concentrated wealth in your hand. Status, power. And in a world that was industrializing so fast, having control over a resource like that, it was everything.
Sounds like a recipe for conflict, right? All these
Yeah.
different groups all wanting the same thing. How did this affect the people who already lived there?
Well, for some, the discovery of diamonds brought hope. But for many indigenous communities, it was devastating. The land grabs, the fight for resources, it led to people being forced off their land, their homes. The Tswana people, for instance, had lived in that region where the diamonds were found for a long time. But when it came to who had rights to the land, their claims were ignored, pushed aside. It was all about the diamonds.
And that's where the Keat Award comes in, if I'm remembering my notes correctly. It seemed pretty complicated, though.
It was a real mess, to be honest. The key word was supposed to settle all the arguments about who owned the land around Kimberley, where the diamonds were. But think about it. You've got the Gurkha, who'd established their own republic there, the Boers wanting to expand their territory, and then the British Empire, always looking for more power. The tension must have been incredible.
So who came out on top with this Keat Award?
At first, it seemed like the Gurkha might actually get to keep a big chunk of the disputed land. But, and this is where power really comes into play, the Gurkha, they were facing so much pressure, so many threats from both the Boers and the British. In the end, they were forced to give up control of the diamond fields. By 1871, that whole area, all that potential wealth, it was part of the British Empire, known as the Crown Colony of Griqualand West.
A classic case of the powerful taking what they want, huh? But what about the people actually doing the mining? What was life like for them down in those diamond mines?
Brutal, especially for the black African miners. At the very beginning, there was this one-person, one-claim system, which gave people a bit of independence. You can picture it, right? The early days of the Kimberley mine, it would become known as the Big Hole later on. You had all these individual diggers working tirelessly, hauling buckets of that diamond-bearing soil out of this ever-growing pit.
Wow. Sounds chaotic. Everyone just digging away in the heat and dust.
Well, it absolutely was. But as the mine got deeper, things got harder, more dangerous. Collapses, the sheer amount of earth to be moved, and finding those diamonds got tougher and tougher. It became obvious that individual miners just couldn't keep up.
So that's when the big names stepped in, right? Cecil Rhodes, Barney Bernardo. You can't talk about the diamond industry without mentioning those two.
True. Larger-than-life figures, both of them, driven by ambition and that hunger for power. But their backgrounds, totally different. Rhodes, he was the strategist, came over from Britain, dreaming of empires. Bernardo, the showman, full of charisma. He'd come from poverty in London, and he used his smarts and his business sense to make a fortune. Those two, their rivalry, their personalities, it ended up shaping the whole diamond industry and the future of Southern Africa, really.
And Rhodes, he was the one behind De Beers, right?
Yeah.
That's the one. He had this knack for business, made these ruthless deals, even teamed up with some unlikely partners, like the Rothschilds, those bankers. He was playing the long game. See, Rhodes understood that controlling the diamonds, it wasn't just about digging them up. It was about controlling the supply, about setting the price for the entire world. And in 1888, he brought out his rival, Bernardo. And that's when De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited was born, a giant, basically a monopoly over diamond production in Kimberley.
So it wasn't enough to control the mines. He had to control the whole global market.
Exactly. De Beers, they marked the end of the independent digger. Rhodes knew that if he limited how many diamonds were available, well, he could make them even more valuable, more desirable. He created a whole system that transformed diamonds from, something relatively common into these highly sought-after treasures.
It's a crazy story, really makes you think. We've gone from those peaceful images of pre-industrial Britain, those cottage industries, to the harsh realities of those South African diamond mines. It's incredible how these places and events, so different on the surface, are all woven together. The Industrial Revolution, it was driven by so much ambition, innovation, but also exploitation. And that's left a mark on the world we live in today. Our relationship with labor, resources, global trade, it's all shaped by this legacy. So next time you think about the Industrial Revolution, ask yourself this: what was the true cost of all this progress? And who really benefited in the end?